In February 1916, a German general said something that should have ended careers. His plan wasn't to take ground, it was to bleed France white. Not victory, not breakthrough, not territory. Attrition as strategy, a machine designed not to win, but to kill. What followed was 303 days of continuous battle, the longest, most savage engagement in human history. Nearly 700,000 casualties on a front barely 15 miles wide. Forests were erased from maps. Villages ceased to exist. The ground itself became a graveyard so saturated with human remains that it is still legally uninhabitable today, more than a century later. And when it was over, neither side had moved more than a few miles. This is not a story about victory. This is a story about what happens when two industrial nations decide to solve a military problem by feeding it human beings. This is Verdun. To understand Verdun, you have to understand what Erich von Falkenhayn believed. By late 1915, Germany's chief of staff had reached a cold conclusion. The war could not be won by breakthrough. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. The Eastern Front was a drain with no clean end in sight. Britain was untouchable behind its navy and its empire's resources. But France had a pressure point. Verdun, a fortress city on the Meuse River, surrounded by a ring of concrete forts built after the humiliation of 1870. Historically sacred to the French nation. The site where Charlemagne's empire had been divided. A name that carried the weight of French identity. Falkenhayn's calculation was precise and ruthless. The French High Command, he argued, would defend Verdun regardless of the military logic. National pride, political pressure, historical symbolism, all of it would compel France to pour men into its defense long after rational strategy would have said withdraw. His memo to the Kaiser, later called the Christmas Memorandum, laid it out in language that reads more like an actuary's report than a military plan. Force France to commit every man she has, then kill them. Not the city, the army. Germany would build an artillery killing ground, draw the French in, and grind them down until the French army as a fighting institution simply ceased to function. Falkenhayn estimated France would exhaust herself trying to hold what she could not afford to lose. What he did not calculate was that Germany would be standing inside the same killing ground. But to understand why this plan was even thinkable, you have to understand what artillery had become by 1916. The artillery of 1916 was not the artillery of 1870 or even 1914. By the time Falkenhayn wrote his memorandum, Germany had spent 2 years industrializing murder. The guns were enormous. The 420 Krupp Gamma Garret, the same type used to destroy Belgian forts in 1914, could fire a shell weighing over 900 kilograms. A single round could open a crater large enough to swallow a house. German planners knew that if they concentrated enough of these weapons on a narrow enough front and fired them for long enough, they could eliminate any fixed fortification built by human hands. But the weapon that would define Verdun wasn't the heavy siege gun, it was the field artillery shell, produced in millions, light enough to transport, reliable enough to fire continuously for hours. The Germans assembled over 1,200 guns along the 8-mile front at Verdun. That is 1 gun for every 11 meters of front. The density is almost impossible to visualize. Standing on that ground today, looking at the horizon, you would need to imagine a weapon pointed at you from every telephone pole distance in either direction, as far as you can see. And Falkenhayn intended to fire those guns until France ran out of men to replace the ones they killed. The plan had a name in German military discussion. Ausbluten, to bleed out, an entire strategic framework built on the assumption that artillery could kill faster than a nation could replace soldiers, that ammunition could be produced faster than men could be trained, and that the correct application of industrial-scale firepower to a specific geography would break an army's ability and will to fight. It was, in the coldest sense possible, a logical plan. At 7:15 in the morning on February 21, 1916, over 1,200 German guns opened fire on a front just 8 miles wide. For 9 hours they did not stop. The noise was heard as far away as the English coast. Men standing in trenches 10 miles back felt the ground move under their feet. The shelling was so concentrated, so sustained, that French soldiers in the forward positions described it not as individual explosions but as a single continuous roar, as if the sky itself had declared war on the earth. Woods disappeared. Not damaged, disappeared. Entire tree lines that had stood for decades were reduced to splinters and craters in hours. French communication lines were cut within the first 30 minutes. Artillery observation posts were silenced. Commanders behind the lines reached for their telephones and heard nothing. The French forward positions had essentially ceased to exist before a single German infantryman moved. Then came the infantry. And here is where Verdun showed something important about where German tactical thinking was going. The assault wasn't a massed wave. Small groups, probing forward, feeling for gaps, pushing through weakness. The infiltration instinct that would become formalized, stormtrooper doctrine in 1917 and 1918, was already present in the men crossing no man's land on February 21, 1916. By the end of day one, the German advance had penetrated several miles into French lines. The French soldiers who survived the opening bombardment described a world that had ceased to follow normal rules. Men who had been in trenches were suddenly in open ground with no trench to return to. Unit cohesion had collapsed. Officers couldn't find their men. Men couldn't find their officers. Communication was gone. Supply was gone. The battle had, in its first hours, become exactly what Falkenhayn intended. A killing field where French soldiers were trapped between advancing Germans and the guns of their own side firing support that could no longer be accurately directed. What kept the French from collapsing entirely in those first days was not a plan. It was individuals, sergeants and lieutenants making decisions without orders, pulling men back to defensible positions, improvising lines from nothing. The institutional collapse that Falkenhayn had planned for did not produce the complete dissolution he had expected. France's army had deeper roots than his calculations had allowed for. But the crisis was real, and it required a response from Paris. Fort Douaumont, the largest, most heavily armored fortress in the entire Verdun defensive ring. Concrete walls meters thick, designed to withstand exactly the kind of bombardment that had just fallen on the French lines for 9 hours. It fell on February 25th. Not to a grand assault, not to a coordinated attack with artillery support and infantry waves. A small German patrol, a few dozen men, found an unguarded entrance. The fort's garrison had been reduced to a skeleton crew. Its heavy guns were unmanned. They walked in. The story of how Fort Douaumont fell is a study in the chaos of institutional collapse under sustained pressure. The fort had been partially demilitarized before the battle, a decision made by French commanders who believed fixed fortifications were now vulnerable to the same heavy artillery that had destroyed Belgian forts in 1914. The heavy guns had been removed and redistributed. The garrison had been reduced. The assumption was that the forts were secondary positions, that the defensive line would hold forward of them. The line did not hold, and now Germany occupied what France considered its most sacred defensive symbol. The symbolic shock was enormous. The most fortified position in one of France's most sacred cities had fallen in 4 days. The psychological impact traveled from the front to Paris to every household that had a son in uniform. News spread the way it always does in wartime, imprecisely, in fragments, distorted by distance and fear. What French civilians understood was that Germany was at the gates of Verdun and the great fortress had fallen. The political pressure on the government was immediate and crushing. France had a decision to make. Withdraw from Verdun and accept the strategic and psychological consequences of abandoning a city that had become, over centuries, a symbol of French identity itself, or reinforce. Pour men and material into a battle that military logic was already beginning to suggest was unwinnable on favorable terms. The answer was predetermined by everything France was as a nation and a political culture. France would fight for Verdun. Every man, every gun, whatever it cost. The only question was, who would command the defense? The man who saved France at Verdun was not supposed to be there. General Philippe Pétain was, by the standards of the French army in 1916, practically a heretic. The French military doctrine before the war had been built on a philosophy called élan vital, the belief that offensive spirit, aggression, and moral force could overcome material disadvantage. Attack, always attack. The regulations, the training, the culture of promotion. All of it rewarded the officer who advanced and punished the one who hesitated. Pétain had spent his career arguing the opposite. Firepower kills soldiers faster than courage can replace them. Frontal assaults against prepared positions are not bold, they are wasteful. An army that bleeds itself dry attacking cannot defend when defense becomes necessary. In the pre-war army, these views had made him a difficult man to promote. When Verdun fell into crisis, France needed exactly that man. Pétain took command on February 25th, the same day Fort Douaumont fell. He arrived at his headquarters late at night after a long drive, and within hours he had begun reshaping the French response around two principles that would define the entire battle. The first was logistics. Verdun had one functioning supply route, a single road 37 miles long running from Bar-le-Duc to the city. The Germans knew it. Their artillery targeted it constantly. Without it, the entire Verdun garrison would be cut off. No food, no ammunition, no reinforcements. Pétain looked at that road and made it the center of his strategy. He organized what became known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Engineers worked around the clock repairing shell damage. Territorial troops lined the sides of the road, filling craters with gravel within minutes of each shell strike. Traffic moved in a single direction, into Verdun on one side, out on the other, with military police stationed at intervals to keep it flowing without pause. At peak operation, a truck passed a given point on that road every 14 seconds. 6,000 tons of supplies per week, 90,000 men per week flowing in and out. The road became the circulatory system of a battle that would last 10 months, and Pétain treated it with the same obsessive attention a surgeon gives to keeping a patient's heart beating. Without La Voie Sacrée, France loses Verdun in weeks. The second principle was rotation. Every previous French defensive battle had kept the same units in place until they were destroyed, grinding formations down to nothing before pulling them back. Pétain rejected this completely. No unit would stay at Verdun long enough to be annihilated. Fresh divisions rotated in. Exhausted divisions rotated out. Recover, refit, return. The mathematics of this decision were deliberately humane and strategically brilliant at the same time. By rotating units constantly, Pétain prevented the complete psychological collapse of any single division. Men knew that however terrible the conditions at Verdun, they would eventually leave. That knowledge, that there was an end to the immediate nightmare even if not to the war, was the difference between a fighting unit and a broken one. But the scale of the rotation meant something else. Nearly 70% of the entire French army passed through Verdun at some point during those 10 months. Roughly 259 French divisions served there out of a total of 330. What this means is almost impossible to fully absorb. Nearly every Frenchman who survived the war had been at Verdun. The battle did not happen to a portion of France. It happened to a generation. The psychological scar was not concentrated. It was distributed across an entire nation's military experience. Numbers tell you scale. They do not tell you what Verdun felt like from the inside. Survivors' accounts describe a landscape that no longer resembled Earth as men understood it. The ground at Verdun had been turned inside out. Shell craters overlapping shell craters, creating a lunar surface of mud and debris that offered no stable footing, no orientation, no landmarks. Men who had served on other parts of the Western Front and were rotated into Verdun described it as a different world, darker, louder, more saturated with death. The smell was one of the first things men noted. Verdun had a smell. The decomposition of thousands of bodies that could not be recovered, mixed with the chemical residue of explosive shells, burning wood, and the particular wet iron smell of blood in cold mud. Soldiers who survived the battle reported that the smell stayed with them for years. Some said it never entirely left. The noise was another world. At peak artillery exchanges, the sound at Verdun was continuous for hours, sometimes days. Men went partially or fully deaf. Communication by voice became impossible over distances of more than a few feet. Officers relayed orders by runner, men who crossed the devastated ground on foot carrying written messages, many of whom never arrived. Sleep was something that happened in fragments, between barrages, in positions where a man could not fully lie down. The physiological effects of sustained sleep deprivation combined with constant threat produced psychological states that soldiers in quieter sectors had never encountered. Men hallucinated. Men wept without knowing why. Men became, over time, something different from what they had been when they arrived. And yet the line held. Not because of grand strategy from Paris or clever orders from headquarters, but because of individual men in individual shell craters making individual decisions to hold one more hour, one more day. The French soldiers at Verdun called the battle le feu, the fire. They called themselves the poilus, the hairy ones, the rough ones. And they endured Verdun the way men endure things that are beyond the capacity of language to fully describe, by refusing to think too far ahead, by concentrating entirely on the immediate problem, by finding in the man beside them the only fixed point in a world that had otherwise come apart. It is worth pausing here to note something that Falkenhayn's plan had not fully accounted for. The German soldiers at Verdun were dying too. This is sometimes lost in accounts that focus on the French experience of the battle. Verdun is remembered, especially in France, as a French ordeal, and it was. But the German units that stood on the other side of the wire were inside the same killing ground. German artillery was effective, brutally so. But French counter-battery fire, rebuilt under Pétain into a systematic and relentless operation, was targeting German supply lines, observation posts, and artillery positions with increasing coordination as the battle progressed. German infantry who reached their objectives often found those objectives to be craters, positions that offered no cover, no supply, and no tactical advantage beyond the line they had started from. The close quarters fighting in the ruins of fortifications and the margins of shell-cratered ground cost Germany as much as it cost France. German officers began reporting in May and June that their units were exhausted, not from one engagement, but from weeks of continuous combat with no adequate rest. The rotation system that Pétain had implemented was not matched on the German side with the same systematic discipline. German units stayed in the line longer. The wear was deeper. By June 1916, the German advance had stalled. Falkenhayn's plan had assumed France would crack. Instead, France had found a commander who understood exactly what kind of war was being fought and refused to fight it on Germany's terms. By summer 1916, something had gone catastrophically wrong with Falkenhayn's plan. Germany was bleeding too. The machine designed to drain France was draining Germany at nearly the same rate. German units rotated into Verdun just as French ones did. German artillery fired millions of shells that had to be manufactured, transported, and replaced. German replacements arrived at the front with less training than the men they replaced, the same institutional erosion that was happening to every army in this war. Then, July 1st happened. The British launched the Battle of the Somme. In a single day, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, the worst single day in its history. But from Germany's perspective, the Somme meant something strategically decisive. Falkenhayn was forced to pull divisions away from Verdun to meet the new crisis on a different sector of the front. The strategic logic of bleeding France white collapsed under the pressure of fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. This is the central strategic irony of 1916 on the Western Front. Britain's decision to launch the Somme, intended in part to relieve pressure on Verdun, ended the phase of the battle where Germany held the offensive initiative. The Somme did not achieve its own breakthrough. It was itself a grinding, catastrophic failure measured in hundreds of thousands of British and German casualties. But it solved, indirectly and at enormous cost, the immediate crisis at Verdun. By August, Falkenhayn was gone, relieved of command, replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who arrived with a different strategic vision but inherited the same grinding battle with no clean way out. The fighting at Verdun continued without the man who had designed it, for reasons that had long since ceased to make strategic sense. Momentum, pride, the simple institutional inability of two armies locked in contact to disengage without it looking like defeat. The French counteroffensives at Verdun in the autumn of 1916 are less remembered than the desperate defense of the spring and summer. They should not be. Under General Robert Nivelle, who would replace Pétain in command at Verdun in May, Pétain having been promoted to command the broader French armies in the region, the French developed what they called the Nivelle method. Carefully prepared, limited objective attacks, heavy artillery preparation targeting specific German positions, infantry advancing behind a precisely timed creeping barrage, a rolling curtain of shell fire that moved forward at a fixed rate, with infantry following directly behind it, crossing ground that German defenders had been forced to take cover from and arriving before those defenders could return to their firing positions. Fort Douaumont, the great fortress whose fall in February had shaken France to its foundations, was retaken on October 24th. The method worked at Verdun. It worked because the objectives were limited, because the artillery preparation was precise, and because the Germans at this point in the battle were weakened by the same attrition that had worn at the French. The reversal of Verdun's symbolic catastrophes, Douaumont back, Fort Vaux back, the ground gradually returning to French control, mattered as much psychologically as it did militarily. By December 1916, after 303 days, the battle effectively ended. The front lines at the close of the battle were almost exactly where they had been in February. 10 months of industrial slaughter had produced movement measurable in miles, and a butcher's bill that neither side could fully absorb. No account of Verdun is complete without the ground. The battlefield today is still largely uninhabitable. So much unexploded ordnance remains buried beneath the surface that French authorities have permanently classified nearly 100 square kilometers as a zone rouge, red zone. Forbidden to agriculture, forbidden to construction, unlivable. During the battle, the artillery density was so extreme, an estimated 60 million shells fired over 10 months, that the soil itself was transformed. Iron fragments, bone fragments, shell casings, human remains, compressed into the earth under boots that sank into it with every step. The forests that were destroyed during the battle were replanted after the war. They grew back over the craters and trenches. If you walk through those forests today, you are walking on a surface that is not flat. It is a continuous series of shallow depressions and ridges, the ghost of a landscape that was worked over by 60 million shells and never fully recovered its original shape. Men didn't just die at Verdun, they disappeared. Roughly 70,000 soldiers on both sides have no known grave. They were absorbed by the ground they were fighting over, their remains scattered by repeated shell fire until identification became impossible. The Douaumont ossuary, built after the war and completed in 1932, contains the unidentified remains of at least 130,000 soldiers, French and German. Small windows are set into the base of the building at ground level. You can still see the bones. 9 villages in the Verdun region were so completely destroyed that they were never rebuilt. They exist today as administrative designations. Villages that have mayors and a legal status but no inhabitants, no buildings, no streets. The French government maintains them in perpetual memory. You can visit them. There is nothing to see except the land itself, and markers where the streets once were. These are called the villages that died for France. They are perhaps the most honest monument to what Verdun actually was. Not a battle that someone won, a place that consumed itself entirely and left behind only the absence of what had been there before. French casualties, approximately 377,000. German casualties, approximately 337,000. Combined, over 700,000 men. In 10 months. On 15 miles of French countryside, Falkenhayn's strategy had failed on its own terms. France had not broken. Its army had not ceased to function as a fighting institution. Pétain's rotation system, la voie sacrée, and the sheer stubbornness of French soldiers who refused to surrender a city that meant everything to the national identity, all of it had held. But the cost of not losing was nearly indistinguishable from the cost of losing. The French army mutinied in 1917. 54 divisions. Mass refusal to attack. Not to defend, not to hold ground, but to launch the kind of offensive operations that had produced Verdun. The men who had survived the furnace had reached a limit and said so, collectively and at risk of execution. The mutinies followed the failure of the Nivelle offensive. The April 1917 attack on the Chemin des Dames ridge that Nivelle had promised would break the German line within 48 hours. The Chemin des Dames became another Verdun. Massive casualties, minimal gains, no breakthrough. And the men of the French army, who had endured 2.5 years of this, decided they would endure no more of the same. The mutinies were suppressed. Prosecutions were carried out. A small number of executions took place, though far fewer than was rumored at the time or believed afterward. Pétain, promoted to overall command of the French army by that point, handled the mutinies with the same understanding he had brought to Verdun. He prosecuted the ringleaders. He also listened. He improved food, leave policies, and medical care. He stopped ordering the mass frontal assaults that had defined French tactics since 1914. He visited the front, as he had always visited the front, and he spoke to the men as someone who understood what they had endured because he had spent 2 years watching them endure it. The French army did not break, but it had told its commanders, in the clearest possible terms, what it would and would not do. He understood that an army is not a machine. It is made of men. And men have limits. Verdun is not remembered because one side won. It is remembered because of what it revealed about the distance between how institutions plan war and what war actually is. Falkenhayn sat at a desk in late 1915 and calculated bleeding rates with the precision of an accountant. He wrote a memorandum that treated human lives as a resource to be consumed in the correct ratio. He built a strategic framework that was, on its own terms, internally logical. The men in the trenches below Douaumont were living inside those calculations. What Verdun produced, ultimately, was knowledge. Terrible, expensive, irreversible knowledge. The Germans took that knowledge and built the stormtrooper doctrine, the answer to what 4 years of industrial warfare had exposed about how armies needed to move and think. Small units. Initiative at the lowest level. Officers who solved problems rather than waited for orders. The infiltration tactics that had appeared in embryonic form on the first day of Verdun were formalized, trained, and deployed at scale in 1917 and 1918. The French took that knowledge and produced Pétain's understanding that soldier welfare and military effectiveness were not in tension. They were the same thing. That an army which is treated as a machine will eventually stop functioning like one. That the rotation of units, the improvement of food and leave and medical care, the acknowledgement that soldiers were human beings with limits, all of this was not softness. It was strategic calculation of a different and more sophisticated kind. Both lessons arrived too late for the men who paid for them. The war had 2 more years to run after Verdun ended. 2 more years of the same industrial machinery, refined and expanded, applied to the same basic problem of how to break a defended line when both sides had the capacity to replace almost anything except the men themselves. There is a photograph taken at Verdun in 1916, reproduced in many histories of the battle, that shows 2 soldiers in a shell crater. They are French. They appear to be asleep. They are not asleep. The photograph was taken by someone on the same side. Nobody was punished for the composition of the image or the decision to take it. It was preserved, printed, and eventually placed in archives where it can still be seen. What is remarkable about the photograph is not the death it shows. The Western Front produced millions of images of death. What is remarkable is the expression on the face of the one soldier whose face is visible. He looks tired. Not terrified, not agonized, tired. In the way of a man who has walked very far and laid down to rest and not gotten back up. That tiredness is what Verdun actually was, underneath the numbers and the strategy and the names of generals and the dates of offensives. An entire generation of men who were walked very far by institutions that did not fully understand what they were walking them toward, and who laid down when they could walk no further. Verdun did not end the war. It ended the idea that the war could be won the way it was being fought. The men who came home from Verdun, on both sides, were different from the men who had left. Not broken, exactly. Verdun's survivors were the toughest human beings their societies had produced, self-selected by 10 months of conditions that killed the less fortunate. But they were changed. They carried the knowledge of what industrial war actually was, not the abstractions of Christmas memoranda and staff maps, but the smell and the sound and the weight of what it meant when a nation decided to solve a military problem by feeding it human beings. Some of them wrote about it. Most of them did not. What they had seen was, in the deepest sense, not fully communicable. Language was built for a world where things could be described in terms of reference points shared by speaker and listener. Verdun had no reference points in the shared experience of civilian life. It was its own world, with its own rules, and it existed for 10 months, and then it was over. And the men who had lived inside it carried it with them back into a world that had never been there. If this changed how you think about industrial warfare and the men who survived it, subscribe. There is more to come.